Hi, everyone. I'm Summer.
I'm Carrie.
And this is Hopoksia podcast.
I'm nervous.
Oh, don't be nervous. It'll be fun. Fuck. Oh my gosh. What the hell just happened? What the hell? What is happening? Make sure you come back. We're going to do this bi-weekly. So make sure you come back to talk to us more about, sex, drugs, and self-improvement.
Welcome back, y'all. Today we're joined by Mollie Murphy Tindle, who I will forever be indebted to for giving me the terms decentralized cult. So today we're going to be talking about our experiences growing up in evangelicalism and our deconstruction of our faith and all of those fun things.
Today we pick up where we left off in the last episode in the middle of our conversation about mental health and what our respective churches taught about that. If you haven't watched the last episode, I do encourage you to go back and listen to that. There's a lot of good conversation there, and also it will give a lot of good context for the rest of the conversation.
So yeah, I mean, ours, in our church, Dad was very much, he's like, yes, anxiety and depression exist, probably only because he had experienced them, very anti-medication. When you go into like my grandmother's and you go, further on that fundy continuum, it was very much mental health is just you're not right with God. It's your fault no matter what, right? You gotta pray it away. Until you go even further, there were some members of her family who see things like schizophrenia as either demonic possession or demonic oppression, which are two different things that they will argue about at length on what constitutes one and what constitutes the other, and if they're even possible. But yes, that is, as a matter of fact, one of her sisters, who I loved very much, and I miss every single day. She was actually, ironically enough, she was a pastor and an evangelist, and she is actually the first person to ever tell me, if this is not what you want, you don't have to do this. It's okay. And so, but I still believe that I don't want to label her when she's not here to label herself, but she was not straight, where she would never felt open enough to be, straightforward on where that was, where she was on that. But she had a lot of, female roommates. But if you asked my grandmother about that, you know what she would say? That was a spirit bothering her. She's not really that way. It's a spirit bothering you. So now you know, Carrie, your attraction to women is just a spirit bothering you.
I really thought I them.
Personally, I think if there's a demonic oppression, it's being attracted to men. Damn it!
For me.
It's really interesting to hear like the small town experiences, which really seem to be rooted in a lot more of like charismatic traditions, which lends themselves to a side of like mysticism and even folklore, like really relying on demons as temptations and as actors, versus not that it doesn't exist in urban Oklahoma too in those churches. It certainly does, but it's really interesting too because a lot of the churches that I grew up around or interacting with would say, yes, Satan exists and demons are in the world. But for the most part, everything came down to human sin. So a lot less on that trajectory. So it's really interesting to hear like almost like the community driven aspect versus is academic driven aspects and how they relate to the church and how they create a lot of the same results in how we felt, how we interacted with our own brains and our own experiences and our own sexual identities. But they're coming from almost two completely different places.
Mm-hmm.
It's really,
There are some churches, and you know, that part of being the preacher's kid is, you know, you got to, if you would sit quietly in the corner and not be noticed, then you got to hear all the different ministers debating things, right? And so I heard a lot of interesting things in my childhood. And there are some who are very much like they actually, the Satan is so, plays such a big role in their idea, like with the way they talk about him. It's like he is also omnipotent, right? Like he's always there and he's always bothering him. Like, how can he be everywhere? You know? So yeah, I don't know. But the funny thing to me is like it's very much more like this mystical, magical ideas, but they're so quick to condemn anything else outside of that as witchcraft.
Mm-hmm.
oh,
I also wonder what it does to their relationship with their communities, because again, we're talking about like what tends to be very small churches, probably I would guess under 100 members for these small towns, and it's almost like by blaming a third party for a lot of things, even just a spirit bothering them, your grandma's able to see her sister as someone who struggled with something but is not defined by that struggle, versus a lot of these churches, like where I come from, the person is defined by that sin until
That's
it's
interesting.
gone. So it doesn't allow you to see that person as dealing with a third party, but rather in constant competition with themselves.
So maybe that's why that kind of becomes the way that they go, because it is with a small town and you do only have you have a limited number of people, and so you can't really just automatically throw everybody away as much as some of these folks would want to, but you can justify it, right?
Yeah. Small theory. Someone should research it.
That's interesting. I mean, it is interesting. I don't know.
Summer,
I'm going to be thinking about that for a while.
Did you identify as leaving the church when you were 14, 15, even if you still had to attend?
Okay. No. I actually started I got married at 18. I had my first kid at 19. I know I took my oldest 3 kids to church. The youngest 2 I have not. So somewhere in there, sometime between 2007-ish, maybe around there. I don't think I left the church entirely until like I wasn't attending at around 2007, like as often or whatever, but I still went. No, I still went because I was still living here and I was still working for the outreach. So I was actually working for not the church, but the nonprofit run by the church, right? Up until 2010. So I guess that's around the time I left, when I actually moved and I got divorced, which is something you don't do. And I think that was really like, I had started it internally for years before that. But once I realized like they can't make that separation, and they can't see, I was just done. I was done with the patriarchy bullshit and the shaming that was happening because I was leaving. And I'm like, I am leaving because I have an obligation to protect my children and to provide them a safe place. And if I stay, I'm not doing that. And one by one, most of these people told me, no, your job is to stay there. God never said you would be happy. God never said you would necessarily be safe. Whatever's happened to you is your fault. You know, all of those things, and the stupid umbrella family structure bullshit.
Protection. These people really have a problem with people being safe.
Yes.
I used that language to my dad over the summer when he and my mom and my siblings, because they got their flying monkeys too.
Yes.
When they were going after me for very loosely attending a Disciples of Christ church that's local, which is essentially Unitarian, and I'm attached to them because I love the people there. Really don't go. But I was using that as my cover with my family for a long time, that I was still going to church, because if I wasn't, that was going to be a significant problem. So I used that as my shield so that we didn't have to have the conversation. And then my dad looked up sermons, dissed my friend Kelly very badly for her views and her preaching. And then they badgered me for weeks about this. And I finally just said, I can't do this anymore. I'm not talking about this. And I said that for weeks. And then I told my dad at some point, like, this is not safe. I am not safe here. And my dad completely mocked the concept of safety. So yeah, all this umbrella of protection that they believe in. But the moment you say, I'm not safe, they're like, no, that's okay. You're not supposed to be safe.
I'm going to start calling it the umbrella of control, because that's really what it's about. That's what it's about. It's about controlling, and you stay within your roles, and you do those things. They don't care about your safety.
On your podcast, for anybody that doesn't know, a lot of that comes from the Institute for Basic Life Principles, which their homeschool arm is called Advanced Training Institute, ATI, created by Bill Gothard in the 1960s and 70s, that really became popular for homeschool families in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. Also popularized by the Duggar family, the Bates family, and a lot of people that run in those circles. So that really crossed denominations. But that image of the umbrella of protection, whether it's just the umbrella of God and the family underneath, or the umbrella of God and the father and the mother and the children in layers of umbrellas, I'm surprised at the number of people that got that through just like exposure to similar concepts, but weren't directly involved in IBLP or ATI. It surprises me sometimes, because like my family wasn't ATI, but my mom used that language ever since I was a small child. So it had made its way through by 1999, 2000 to a lot of like mainstream evangelicalism.
Oh yeah. We were buying our literature for like Sunday school literature and stuff from it was Apostolic Press or something like that. Can't remember the name of it, the actual company, something to do with flame, who knows. There's always the biblical imagery and everything.
Yeah. It's like when Mardel starts becoming too liberal for you because they carry Joyce Myers and rosaries, like, you've gone too far.
Right. But even they used, like, they used the same diagram. They wouldn't, attribute it to where it came from or anything, but they used the same thing. Hell, we got taught this shit at school from our teachers and stuff. They wouldn't tell you that's where it came from, but that's where it came from. And I mean, some of them, they were going to, let's see, the churches in town. There's the Assembly of God church, there's a Church of Christ, and there's a Baptist church. So they're not like, fringe fundamentalist groups, but, they're mainstream denominations, and they're still getting the same teachings. And then they're teaching them to the children.
You made a point earlier that a lot of people are like, where did this come from? Especially as we talk about, the 2016 election, January 6th, like all of these, like what we're dealing with now as far as seeing like white Christian nationalism really take the main stage. And I think people like us that have experienced this pretty much our entire lives, and a lot of people older than us too, have been saying this for years, like almost like the Old Testament prophets, like, hey, shit's happening. Just because it hasn't happened to you yet, just because it hasn't hit your PCUSA church, just because it hasn't come to First Presbyterian downtown or First Baptist, doesn't mean it's not happening. And you just look at like the evolutions within the Southern Baptist Convention, which is like a bellwether for what's like the conversations happening across the nation. Just look at that for the last few years. Look at the evangelical conference structures and the fact that they were all dealing with sexual assault, and then how they covered that up. And these conversations have been happening. They've been gaining ground quietly since the 1990s with God's Guns and Gays. And now it's, what was it? The on the side of the bus for that Georgia election, Jesus, Guns, Babies. Like, yeah. It's terrible. But yeah, so for anybody that's surprised, I think that's why it's important to have these conversations. Is it's like,
true.
you know, I'm 26 and this has been my entire life and it was happening well before then. So it's just something that not everybody saw coming. Not everybody saw the evolution of.
Right. I think a lot of like the quote unquote mainstream churches, when I was young, you know, I'm 40, a lot of them were very much, oh, you know, they would laugh it off and they're like, oh, that's just, you know, that's them over there, you know, and they would talk about it quietly.
But then
And
you
I
talk
don't
about,
think they saw it coming, that it would infiltrate into, you know, and then by the time I'm in my early 20s, the Baptist church, like, and I mean, you know, that is a large denomination and it's, you know, they're having issues with, like, they had a youth group. I can't remember what it was called. I sat here all day trying to think of what it was called and I can't remember now. And which we thought was normal. Church camp, typical, right? Turned out he was training these kids like basically at a paramilitary camp.
well,
And because it had slowly happened and the parents were shocked and they had not ever seen it coming.
Yeah, that's another interesting avenue for like either research or analyzing what we've experienced as like a social collective within these decentralized cults. The rise of paramilitary groups in the 1990s as a response to Waco and the Oklahoma City bombing parallel a lot of the rise in militaristic language and training groups that churches used. IBLP's Alert Camp and a lot of other organizations really start to echo each other. So you have, not only is this extreme right-wing thing starting to happen, but you have the evolution of that with religious language at the same time, which I think should indicate how closely connected these groups are already, even in the 1980s and 1990s, more than the Reagan Republicans and the Reagan Alliance with the moral majority. There's a lot of grassroots, probably not even astroturfing at the time, but like actual grassroots action happening from that side of things. But I know we need more quantitative evidence to actually prove that.
Right. I know a lot of people don't believe me, especially, you know, up there in the metro, you know, we have the conversations, particularly in policy circles, you know, about guns and things. And they're like, you know, and they're very often people who have not spent much time in rural areas like to talk for us. And they're like, you know, well, they have all these guns because of hunting and stuff. I'm like, no. I remember when that shift happened with Waco. On average, most people had 2 or 3 guns in their house, right? Because you have different kinds of game, you know, you need different calibers. That was it. It really was unusual. There was, you know, maybe 1 or 2 people that might have more than that. There was a huge shift. I remember sitting in my grandmother's living room watching the compound burn. Like, this was a big deal to a lot of religious fundamentalists. For months, every time the churches were open, they were talking from the pulpit about persecution and martyrdom, and the government. The government is going to come after us. That is when militarization, you know, of all of these folks started. I remember like them talking, and you know, I was still a kid, but I remember them talking about plans on how, you know, how to get guns, where you get them, how to stockpile them, where to put them, reloading shells. Like, the survivalist thing went into high gear then. It's not been about hunting in rural Oklahoma. It started then with the whole idea of the government is about to persecute us. And that's when we got all the talk about the martyrs. People started buying Fox's Book of Martyrs like crazy. And like, you literally were taught in some of our Sunday schools, we were taught, you know, you were put through drills in some churches about what do, you know, if somebody says you have to denounce God or die. And like, you literally,
The combination of factors here is fascinating because you have Tim LaHaye, who's been on the right wing working with, I'm not going to remember names right now, but
Okay.
people like Sarah Posner and power worshippers, I don't remember her name right now, Brad Onishi, religion scholars, like they've been documenting these shifts and these movements and their interactions for a really long time. Tracing him from like the Goldwater era in the 1960s, and before that, the John Birch Society in the 1940s, 1950s, McCarthyism, anti-red. But so that's where a lot of these roots and conversations start to happen. But in the 1990s, you have Waco, at Ruby Ridge in Waco. You have the broadcast of the internet is starting to happen, and more fears about the mark of the beast and revelations, and this new focus on, tribulation, the end times, the rapture. Tim LaHaye is producing books and content surrounding this. And then you have Columbine as well. And so not only is it the fear of it happening to individual people and churches, if you will, if you consider Waco like a church structure, but you have schools. And so, yeah, you get this combination, and then that myth of the girl Rachel being asked if he was a Christian and being shot, which is, as people documented, pretty much a straight up myth. But that gets popularized for any of us who were elementary school children in the 1990s and like the 2000s, especially. I remember my brother reading the biography her father wrote about her when he was in 6th grade. And, my mom was very sensitive to guns because of some family issues. And that still came through very quietly. Columbine was still talked about very quietly. So yeah, you've got this really interesting intersection of things going on that, along with the rise of paramilitary groups on the right and the language of God's guns and gays, which our illustrious Jim Inhofe helped promote, but yeah, you've got this increased militarization. And then you get to the Tea Party in 2008. So you go another decade, 15 years later, the reaction to Barack Obama's election, the Tea Party movement kicking off, and it just gets worse. Like, that's the era that I really entered politics, was the anti-Obama era. And I remember that language, the language of secession, the language of stockpiling, of overthrow. Even in this urban area that I grew up in Tulsa and Wasso, men carried guns to church all the time. They packed concealed all the time. And my dad would tell me, like, oh yeah, this person has talked about their stockpile before. And to the point where I would like have dreams and thoughts about like we are going to be persecuted because that's what we were told.
Yeah, we were told that a lot. One thing I don't think a lot of people understand outside these circles is that, like, part of the political push that we're seeing is because they're trying to bring about the end times as they believe they're going to happen.
It's like the end times on their terms.
Like right.
Times in Revelation, but we need guns to protect us. But we also want all these non-Christians to die and go to hell. But we would rather not die, so we're going to have guns.
Right.
It's like they won't go. Carrie, the other intersection with that's the anti-vax movement, which people have been freaking out about since the COVID-19 vaccines, but it was like really part of all that process. Carrie, was your family anti-vax?
Surprisingly, no.
Okay.
I think let me rephrase that. They are anti-vax, but because my aunt is not, and she has my nephew who is 5 now, she told them that they would not be allowed to see him if they were not vaxxed. So they got vaxxed for that. That's the only.
But you got your vaccines when you were an infant and.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Got all of
When did the anti-vax movement really become a thing?
Andrew Wakefield in the 1990s with his study that the MMR vaccine creates autism in children. The study of
That's right.
Children.
Times is bullshit. Like the whole thing.
He got paid for the study. There were 8 children. This is not a large scale study. And a lot of them weren't even were having other issues unrelated to it. And he's recently, in the last 2 years, been touring with anti-vax and right-wing rallies, some of them coming through Tulsa, like the Freedom Rallies. Andrew Wakefield has been coming over with all this, or Dr. Jim Meehan is the local Tulsa. He's an eye doctor. He doesn't have anything to do with this. And he in Wakefield live in Brisbane. But I told my mom like 5 years ago, I was like, this whole thing was a complete myth, right? Like somebody made it up, got paid off. This is bogus science. And she didn't listen.
My grandparents absolutely believe it. And because I told them, like, I started working with like autistic children when I was like in college and like the tail end of like high school. And they so firmly believe that vaccines cause autism. And when you explain to people that think that, like when you explain to them that autism is genetic as much as like hair color and eye color, they shut down like immediately. Like they just cannot believe it. And like telling them that even there's children that are not vaccinated that are still autistic, they can't wrap their minds around that either. They're like, well, they must have autism because like their mother was vaccinated before she got pregnant with them. I'm like,
I know of a girl that blames her eye muscle turn on getting vaccinated as a child. And I'm like, honey, I'm not great with eye muscles. That's not like, I didn't come from a background of pediatric eye care. But eye turns show up at the same time as vaccinations happen. So I think we have a correlation causation issue here.
And like
vaccines don't cause eye turns as a rule.
It's just so hard because like telling people that as an infant, like you have so very little control over like everything that you do. Like you're functioning on infant instincts. Like you cry when you're hungry, you want to be changed. You roll your head around because it's uncomfortable. Like you do these things as an infant based on like your needs. And telling them that signs of autism don't show up until you get older and you start having like motor control problems, or you start talking and you start fixating on things. Like that's about the time you start getting more of your vaccines. And it's so hard to explain to them, like, you're not going to know somebody's autistic when they're born. Like they just cry and they sleep and they eat and they poop. Like that's just what they do. So it's like, it's so difficult.
But I also think for some folks, there's this element in here of there's a big undercurrent in a lot of these churches about having anything quote unquote wrong with you is caused by sin, right? So like you did something wrong, your parents did something wrong. So there's this compulsive need develops to find something to blame things on. Which
really hurts because like you're telling your child that they are wrong, like just for being alive. And I remember what class it was, but I was taking in college. I was taking a class and my professor was very Christian. It was a required class, I had to take it. But she was like, parents, when like they have a child that has Down syndrome or a child that has like cerebral palsy or anything like that, they have to mourn the loss of their perfect child that God gave them or was supposed to give them. But you did something wrong, or you were tempted by Satan, and so he transformed your baby into this. That's incredibly damaging to like.
Yeah, the anti-science threads here are really interesting because you have the anti-vax, you have the anti-autism, you have the anti-anything wrong, but then you also, I think we could enter that space of talking about this with gender non-conforming children, children who want to live as their real identity, and sexual orientation. And the way that we all know that that is also something that happens inside a person that often doesn't come out until later. But it's the same kind of language about mourning that perfect child, which is also another anti-science aspect or anti-expertise aspect of a lot of these religions.
Right. I think it goes even beyond anti-science. They're just downright anti-intellectual. Yes, entirely, because it and it makes sense, because if you have the ability or willingness to critically analyze things, then you're not going to conform and obey.
Well, and you're also going to be able to find the circular logic, you know. presuppositionalism as a doctrine, as a theology, which didn't exist until like the 1890s. The idea that if it doesn't come from the Bible, it doesn't exist, and the Bible affirms itself, is circular reasoning. But that doesn't mean people don't use it. And some of the biggest lines, I mean, even as I was a Christian, like the amount of cognitive dissonance I was experiencing was to this level. I was realizing I was bi, I was scared, I didn't know what to do about it, but I thought for a long time, you know, we can go into a whole conversation about like purity culture and sexual dysfunction too.
Oh, we need to do that too.
The level of cognitive dissonance was, I literally would tell like my husband or like a close friend, like, you know, if the Bible didn't say anything about being gay, I wouldn't feel any way about people doing that. Like, it wouldn't affect me. It doesn't matter. Like, people can live how they want. But it's only because it's in the Bible that like I feel like that's not right for me. But even that cognitive dissonance is stupid because it's like the Bible affirming itself, and but it basically saying, yeah, these people are totally fine to be people. It's just because of this one thing that I can't be myself or that somebody else can't be themselves. Like,
and there's I don't remember the name of the person, and it's gonna drive me insane, but they were talking about how the Bible was mistranslated, which obviously like a lot of it probably was, most of it, the majority. And they were talking about that section where it says like man should not lie with man, and it was mistranslated, and it was saying like man should not lay with children.
Right.
Because it's about power and sex and power.
But it never about man laying with man. Like, it was never about being gay. It was never about homosexuality in any form. It was about pedophilia. Like, you should not lay with children. And so people like to quote that, not knowing that it was mistranslated. And when you tell them that, they just shut down. They're like, no, God translated. He wanted it to be translated at this point.
Exactly.
Translations are incredible. The RSV, all these translations from the 20th century, and the fights over like the NIV, and then obviously Summer, you brought up the King James conversation.
King James.
The 1611 King James version of the Bible, which we know is like full of horrific flaws in its translation process. And so yeah, and that's part of what helped me deconstruct too, was going, I can't trust that what I'm reading is real. And I'm not good with languages enough to learn another language.
But then they say, like, if you are going to believe anything, you have to believe the Bible. God wrote the Bible through his people. Like, no.
My dad's solution to that was to get us a Strong's Concordance, because you can look up the original Greek and Hebrew. Because his thing was, I've seen so many people, you know, be dogmatic about things and twist scripture. I want you to never just take what somebody's word for it, and to look up the original language. He probably wishes he hadn't taught me to do that, because he has not been able to win a religious debate with me in 30 years. And, and honestly, it led to a lot of my deconstruction. Because I'm like, yeah, most of what y'all say is bullshit.
Right. Like, look at the
most of what's being taught
around the ESV, the English Standard Version, which came out in like 2010, 2012. Like, when I graduated from high school in 2014, my gift from the church was an ESV. Wayne Grudem, you'll know for him for his systematic theology, a big supporter of Donald Trump, came out in another part of my important deconstruction in 2016. Wayne Grudem and James Dobson, what's the word I want? Endorsed Trump. And I was like, bye. But anyways, so all these people, they basically turned the ESV into a Bible that affirms what's called complementarianism, or basically that patriarchal family structure of submissive wives and submissive women in society too. And it's very intentional, very explicit. Somebody else had a video on that one recently. I can't remember who. Anyways,
when I got married, my cousin was to officiate the wedding, and he almost backed out because I refused to put obey in the vows. He literally had to pray about it for days to make sure God was okay with me not saying I was going to obey this man.
I'm pretty sure I said obey because everything was like the way of the traditional church. But James and I did like a remarriage, what we called a 2.0 last year. and
Super nice.
explicitly left obey out. In fact, I explicitly promised to not obey him.
Nice. Very nice. See, we wouldn't have gotten, I think I was kind of already starting to deconstruct because getting married wasn't important to me. We honestly would not have gotten married if it had not been for our family saying you have to be married, you can't live in sin, and all of that nonsense. And so we're like, if it'll shut y'all up, we'll get married. So we did. Of course, I didn't understand the legal ramifications. Otherwise, we never would have done it. But yeah, I wasn't going to obey. I still don't obey.
My family's very upset. I have not been married yet.
Let's get married, Carrie.
Summer. Oh, that's going to be summer.
You know, it's kind of weird how we internalize these things. Like you were talking about, you know, your thoughts about sexuality, you know, in scripture. And in my head, it worked a different way. Like I don't know how to explain it. Like I knew in my head, like, okay, the attraction I'm having to girls is automatic. Like it's not something I can control. But God, you know, and so God doesn't make doesn't make mistakes. We always heard that, right? God doesn't make mistakes. But God doesn't make gay people. So then it must not really be that. It's not the same as the attraction that I feel to men.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like this weird, very strange way to internalize it.
If you want to jump into the purity culture conversation, I can.
Oh yeah.
Talk about that a little bit too.
Fuck purity culture. How's that for an intro? That's my segue. I fucking hate purity culture.
I read Kiss Dating Goodbye a few times by the time I was like 15, I think. My parents told me since I was a really young child, like, you're not going to be a teenager, you're going to be a young woman because teenagers are terrible and you're going to be good. And also we're going to do courtship, you're never going to date. And then they never prescribed anything for what courtship would ever look like. And even when I asked them when I was like 15, there was like no answer. I had my notes ready to take down, like, okay, what are we doing? We're going to have this conversation because, you know, I'm getting older. And like, what if, you know, somebody comes to dad and like, what do I do? And how do we do this? And they just had like, I don't know. Super helpful. But I had internalized so much of purity culture. Like I didn't know what sex was until I was 16.
Oh, wow.
I had internalized so much of purity culture that I did not have attraction to anybody. And if I did, I shut it off and turned it off, cut it out. Like my friends would talk about boys sometimes, or they would confess the guilty sin of liking someone because that was a big deal. You know, if you like someone, it's a sin. And of course, you know, I listened to them and talked things through and never admitted. And I think a lot of them thought that I just never liked anybody. I never talked about it with my mom. I just like tried to cut it off. So I had no idea that I was actually attracted to women because I didn't have attraction to men. I didn't know what sex was. I know like around 15, I noticed that hands were nice. Like people's hands could look really nice. And that was like the first thing I was like, oh, those hands look nice and strong. That's cool. Like nice hands. It's nice to hold hands. And like, that was the extent, like my little innocent head. So when I got married and, you know, now you're expected to have sex and I couldn't have sex without hurting, called vaginismus. Never went to the gynecologist because I was terrified. Getting on birth control was a fight with my mom. So I never went to the gynecologist because, you know, all this shame about people seeing your body and like, so I didn't go till this year when I went because I was choosing to put my health and the health of my partners, plural, first instead of my fear. But I struggled with vaginismus for 7 years and couldn't have sex because of that. But at the time I also started, as I started awakening sexually, because there's still other parts of sex that are really good, as, you know, I got married, so it was all within the confines of marriage. I started realizing that I wasn't just attracted to men. And I was like, well, I can't be a lesbian. And I didn't know what bisexuality was. So I thought it was binary. I can't be a lesbian because being a lesbian is wrong. And I can't be wrong because I'm a Christian and I can't do that.
Right.
And then I just kind of kept lingering, especially as I was continuing to struggle with sex and felt really guilty for it for years. Because that's also part of purity culture is once you're married, you can't like anybody else ever. You have to shut down everything, including emotional cheating on your husband. And you have
I have a whole rant about that.
and you have to have sex with them whenever they want, which I couldn't perform. I couldn't do without being in excruciating pain. And it was awful. And everything about sex just bothered me because I internalized it so much. There was no pleasure. And so I was talking to James on the phone when he was in Georgia. I was driving home from something. And I go, James, what if I'm bisexual? Because I learned that word finally. I learned what it meant. And he goes, duh. And I was still a Christian at the time. So I was like a Christian bisexual who was staying with my spouse, you know, all the nice little things. So the story ends better, but that's like my experience with like a lot of that internalized, which like it doesn't end when you get married. It doesn't end when you have the legitimate fulfillment of those illegitimate feelings, as they say. You carry it with you even when you're no longer under it because it scars you up horribly.
Yeah.
It does. And it's hard sometimes because there's so much purity culture is so ubiquitous in this country. It's in everything. And like I said earlier, purity culture is foundational to rape culture. They cannot be separated. I know people want to frame it as, oh, it's about, no, we're trying to respect women and blah, blah. That's bullshit, okay? Because purity culture inherently means there is no consent. There's no consent.
About it. Marital rape, which people say doesn't exist, is like rewarded within a lot of iterations of purity culture.
It's encoded in the law. There is a different definition under the Oklahoma Criminal Code for rape if you are married to the perpetrator. Because marriage law is property law, you belong to your spouse. We had true love waits at our school.
Oh my gosh, that's awful. Like I had a
thing
that my dad gave me, but like that is so bad.
It was an assembly, you know, we had to go to an assembly. And so we all went and we get in there and it's true love waits. And I'm like, what the, and you know, I didn't know what that was yet. And yeah. And then they have to sign the pledge cards and the teachers are standing there watching you, making sure you sign it. And you can't leave until you sign it. And I'm just like.
My friend had to do that through her church. So at least it was through her church, not her school, but they had the whole pledge.
Yeah, we had to do the pledge and everything, and you had to sit through the whole shamey bullshit about how sex is wrong and all of that, and you have the pledge, and of course I was already having sex at this point, and this just offended me to my core that they were being so blatantly shaming and coercive about this that when I left, I'm like, that's it, I'm getting laid this weekend, I don't care. And that's what I did because I'm like, and I wouldn't have if they hadn't done that. But I'm just like, it made me feel so defiant because I'm like, fuck y'all, this is not okay. I think I was 14 or 15 at the time, but I understood at 15 because that was when that's when I ended up with that one guy. Yeah, because I was even at 15, I recognized that was not okay. It's just so, there is nothing about purity culture that doesn't creep me out. The purity balls, the rings, it's just, I have a visceral reaction to all of it.
It makes me laugh that I pledged my purity to my father before I even knew what sex was. And because of that, my mom would make me, when I was disagreeing or not obeying quickly enough or anything like bad attitude, which, you know, I was a very compliant child, so that was pretty limited. She'd say, look at your ring. You promised to obey. So really, it was an obedience pledge more than anything else. That's the way they interpreted it. And so I think about that a lot. And I haven't decided what to do with my ring yet. It is silver. But yeah, it's awful.
You had a ring too, didn't you, Carrie?
Yes, I did. And I lost it. I don't know where it went. It obviously meant so much to me.
Yeah, we all lost it at some point, Carrie.
I remember doing true love waits in high school twice. I went through it twice. We had it once at the school, and then we went to a big giant conference that was like thousands.
Oh my God. I forgot about the conferences, the giant conferences and the stadium concerts.
It was like, it was some big artist now. It was when she was just starting out, because I was in...
Probably like Carrie Job or Brittany Cole.
It was Brittany Cole.
Oh my god!
It was her, because I think I bought her with my like allowance when I got.
Oh wow!
So I was scared. Oh, go ahead.
We went, and it was really funny because our youth leader and his wife like went, but we also had like 2 students, like we had a boy and a girl lead student, you know. Right after the conference, they got caught having sex in the bathroom.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was just wild.
I was spared a lot of the conferences because even though other kids in the church would go to like the Ignite conference or the church camp or missions trips, my parents had this idea that wasn't okay to spend that much time with your peers. And so I went to adult Sunday school and wasn't part of the youth group. And by the time my sister entered the youth group age, she was allowed to go because she also had friends and I didn't have friends, and she pushed it. And I was too terrified. So I got spared the large conference settings a lot of the time.
You just triggered a memory. I forgot all about that whole idea of children aren't supposed to be like, because when I was a kid, that was becoming a popular thing. Children's church was bad. You don't separate for Sunday school because kids aren't supposed to be like, they need to be sitting with the adults and learning like the adults because you're expected to act like a little adult. Oh my God. Yeah, sorry. That just I had blocked that one out.
I don't know what the purity culture conversations in the youth group were, because I just got everything either from my parents or from these books,
right?
And then took them to their logical conclusion, and didn't interact with anybody, and was basically a recluse because I thought that was best, and because I had social anxiety and didn't know it. So
it was bad. Like, there were several kids in my youth group who weren't out yet. I wasn't out yet. I didn't even know what it was, honestly. But I remember it was very much like, if you're having sex before you're married, they would use like the analogies, like the Coke bottle analogy or the gum analogy.
I've heard the gum. What's the Coke bottle analogy?
The Coke bottle, so they would make you sit in a circle and they would have a bottle of Coke that wasn't opened yet. And then somebody would open it, and that was then taking your virginity.
Ew!
Pass it around the circle, and everybody had to take a sip of it. And at the end, they would say, and now this Coke bottle is all used up and full of germs, and nobody wants to drink this anymore. Ew. And I was like, that's disgusting.
That's like the chewing gum analogy, or the tape analogy.
The tape. I forgot about the tape.
It was gross. Like, I can't believe I did that and participated in that.
Well, you're forced to.
It was bad. And like, I remember there was one day we were talking about how you're supposed to be obedient to your partner as a woman. You're supposed to be obedient to your husband. And my boyfriend was in the youth group also, and he was sitting next to me, and I remember him looking over at me and being like, yeah, you're supposed to be obedient to me. And I was like, we're breaking up right now.
Good for you.
We're not married. That doesn't count. It was rough, and I have a lot of like traumatic like flashbacks about it. Them telling me like, you're going to hell for kissing somebody, or you're gonna be whatever, nobody wants a used up girl, and like, you're worthless. Like, that was the exact like wording that we got every Wednesday.
And this is why I really hate like the conversation, even like the flippant mentions of body count and bullshit like that. And I know people get tired of me bitching about it, but every time someone around me says something about it, I start pushing back, because I'm like, that is what it's based on. If you have had, quote, too many partners, then you're worthless. Like, that is purity culture, plain and simple. And it is damaging and it's harmful. It is not okay. It's
called being a low value woman and being a high value man.
I am a no value woman. Stay away from me.
Value woman.
I have nothing to offer you.
I'm a great woman. I am great at a discount. Okay.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. And if you want to make sure you don't miss any of the uploads, be sure to turn on those notifications so you will know as soon as those go up. Also, like us on social media at Hopoksia Podcast, or the easiest way is to go to our website, hopoksia.com. That's HOPOKSIA.com. And the links to all the socials and all the podcast feeds are right there. And we just want to thank you all for sharing your time with us, hanging out with us, and we hope to spend more time with you in the future.